In the history of cinema, few villains have orchestrated their rise to power with such calculated precision. While heroes charge into battle, one man spent decades weaving a web of deception so intricate that even the greatest Jedi Masters couldn't see through it until it was far too late.
The Republic will be reorganized into the first Galactic Empire!
This is the story of Sheev Palpatine, Senator, Chancellor, Emperor, and the most dangerous Sith Lord the galaxy has ever known. Chapter 1: The Boy from Naboo. Long before he became the Emperor, Sheev Palpatine was just another child growing up on the peaceful world of Naboo. But even then, there were signs that this boy was different. Born into a wealthy family with political connections, young Sheev displayed an intelligence that both impressed and unsettled those around him. His father, Chancellor Palpatine, was a nobleman who had little time for his son's peculiarities. From an early age, Sheev showed a fascination with power. Not the crude, obvious kind that bullies wielded in schoolyards, but the subtle art of manipulation. He could convince his classmates to do things they never would have considered, all while making them believe it was their idea. Teachers praised his eloquence and charisma, never noticing the cold calculation behind his warm smiles. But Naboo's pastoral beauty couldn't contain the darkness growing within him. As a teenager, Sheev began to experience strange dreams. Visions of ancient temples, red lightsabers, and voices whispering secrets of the Force. He didn't understand what they meant, but he felt drawn to them like a moth to flame. The turning point came during a family trip to Naboo's moon. An accident, or what appeared to be one, claimed the lives of his parents and siblings. Only Sheev survived, inheriting not just the family fortune, but freedom from the expectations and limitations they represented. Local authorities found no evidence of foul play, but those who knew Sheev best began to wonder. His grief seemed performative.
Chapter 2: The Dark Apprentice. It was then that he appeared. Darth Plagueis, a moon who had been watching the young Naboo native from afar. Plagueis had sensed the boy's potential in the Force, his natural affinity for the dark side, and most importantly, his ruthless ambition. Under the cover of a chance meeting at a political gathering, Plagueis approached Sheev with an offer that would change the galaxy forever. The training began immediately. While publicly pursuing his political education, Sheev secretly learned the ways of the Sith. Plagueis taught him that the Force was not a mystical energy field to be respected, but a tool to be dominated. The weak saw the Force as something that flowed through all living things. The strong understood that it could be bent, twisted, and shaped to serve their will. Sheev proved to be an exceptional student. His political acumen combined with his growing mastery of the dark side made him the perfect weapon for Plagueis's grand design. The rule of two had guided the Sith for a millennium. Always two there are, a master and an apprentice. But Plagueis had grander ambitions. He sought to unlock the secret of eternal life, to break the cycle of master and apprentice forever. Under Plagueis's tutelage, Sheev learned to hide his Force sensitivity so completely that even trained Jedi couldn't detect it. This would prove crucial in the years to come. He also learned patience, the most important lesson of all. The Sith had been in hiding for 1,000 years, building their strength, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. That moment was fast approaching. As Sheev's political career began to flourish, Plagueis revealed the ultimate plan. The Republic was already weakening from within, corrupted by bureaucracy and complacency. The Jedi, once guardians of peace and justice, had become complacent peacekeepers, more concerned with meditation than action. It would be surprisingly easy to destroy both institutions, but it would require patience, cunning, and absolute commitment to the dark side.
Chapter 3. The Senator's Rise. Sheev Palpatine's entry into galactic politics seemed natural, even inevitable. His family's noble status, combined with his own considerable charisma, made him a popular choice to represent Naboo in the Galactic Senate. But what his constituents didn't realize was that they had just elected a Sith Lord to one of the most powerful positions in the Republic. As a senator, Palpatine was everything the Republic claimed to value. He was articulate, passionate about justice, and genuinely seemed to care about the common citizens who suffered under the Republic's increasingly inefficient bureaucracy. His speeches were masterpieces of rhetoric, striking just the right balance between idealism and pragmatism. He built coalitions across party lines, earning respect from colleagues who would have been horrified to learn his true nature. But beneath this carefully crafted persona, Palpatine was methodically studying the Republic's weaknesses. He identified key senators who could be bought, blackmailed, or otherwise influenced. He began placing his own people in crucial positions throughout the government, creating a shadow network that would serve him when the time came. The relationship with his constituents on Naboo was particularly important. Palpatine genuinely cared about his homeworld, not out of sentimentality, but because Naboo served as his power base. He ensured that Naboo prospered under his representation, creating genuine loyalty among his people. This wasn't just political theater, it was strategic investment in his future. During this period, Palpatine also began to study the Jedi more closely. As a senator, he had legitimate reasons to interact with the Jedi Council, to attend briefings and request their assistance with various matters. Each interaction was an intelligence-gathering operation, allowing him to understand their methods, their blind spots, and most crucially, their overconfidence. The Jedi believed they could sense deception, that the Force would warn them of any significant threat to the Republic. They were wrong. Palpatine's mastery of the dark side allowed him to project exactly what he wanted them to sense: dedication to democracy, concern for justice, and complete honesty. They saw him as one of the few senators they could truly trust. Chapter 4. The Phantom Menace. The crisis that would ultimately destroy the Republic began, fittingly enough, with a trade dispute. The Trade Federation's blockade of Naboo seemed like a relatively minor issue, the kind of bureaucratic squabble that the Senate dealt with regularly. But Palpatine had been instrumental in orchestrating the entire conflict from behind the scenes. Working through intermediaries, Palpatine had convinced the Trade Federation that they could blockade Naboo without serious consequences. The Republic's response would be slow and ineffective, giving them time to force favorable trade agreements. What the Trade Federation didn't realize was that they were being manipulated by the very senator they were trying to pressure. When Queen Amidala arrived on Coruscant to plead for her world's freedom, she found a sympathetic ear in Senator Palpatine. He expressed outrage at the Trade Federation's actions and frustration with the Senate's slow response. More importantly, he began to plant seeds of doubt about Chancellor Valorum's leadership. The Republic needed strong leadership, he suggested, not the weak bureaucracy that had allowed this crisis to develop.
Palpatine's masterstroke was convincing Amidala to call for a vote of no confidence in Chancellor Valorum. He presented this as the only way to save Naboo, appealing to her desperation and her genuine love for her people. What Amidala didn't realize was that she was playing directly into Palpatine's hands, removing one of the few obstacles to his own rise to power. The vote succeeded, and suddenly Palpatine found himself nominated as a candidate for Chancellor. His campaign was brilliant in its simplicity. He positioned himself as a reluctant leader, a man who wanted nothing more than to serve his people, but who felt compelled to act in the Republic's hour of need. He promised to bring efficiency to the bureaucracy, to restore the Senate's ability to act decisively, and to ensure that no world would suffer as Naboo had suffered. Meanwhile, on Naboo itself, the crisis was being resolved in exactly the way Palpatine had foreseen. The Jedi had intervened, young Anakin Skywalker had destroyed the Trade Federation's control ship, and Naboo was free. The boy had shown remarkable force sensitivity and piloting ability, details that Palpatine filed away for future consideration.
Chapter 5. Chancellor Palpatine. Palpatine's election as Supreme Chancellor marked the beginning of the end for the Republic, though no one realized it at the time. His victory speech was a masterpiece of political theater, emphasizing his humble origins, his dedication to democratic values, and his commitment to healing the Republic's divisions. Even his former opponents were moved by his apparent sincerity. But behind closed doors, Palpatine began implementing his true agenda. His first priority was consolidating power while maintaining the appearance of democratic governance. He began by restructuring the Chancellor's office, ostensibly to improve efficiency, but actually to centralize decision-making authority in his hands. Each reform seemed reasonable, even necessary, given the Republic's obvious problems. Palpatine also began cultivating relationships with key military leaders, corporate executives, and planetary governors. He presented himself as a practical leader who understood that sometimes difficult decisions had to be made for the greater good. Slowly but surely, he began building the network of loyalists who would eventually become the foundation of his empire. The Jedi Council, meanwhile, remained oblivious to the threat growing under their noses. They saw Palpatine as a valuable ally, a politician who actually listened to their concerns and took their advice seriously. When they expressed worry about the growing influence of the dark side, Palpatine nodded gravely and promised to do everything in his power to support their investigations. During this period, Palpatine also began his long-term project of corrupting Anakin Skywalker. He had recognized the boy's enormous potential during the Naboo crisis, and now he began the slow process of building a relationship with the young Jedi. It started innocently enough: friendly conversations, small gifts, expressions of interest in Anakin's training and well-being. The genius of Palpatine's approach was that he never pushed too hard or too fast. He allowed Anakin to come to him, positioning himself as a mentor figure who understood the boy's frustrations with the Jedi Order's restrictions. While the Jedi taught patience and emotional control, Palpatine quietly encouraged Anakin to embrace his feelings, to trust his instincts, to believe in his own exceptional destiny. Chapter 6. The Clone Wars began. 10 years into Palpatine's chancellorship, the Republic faced its greatest crisis since its founding. A separatist movement led by the former Jedi Count Dooku threatened to tear the galaxy apart. Thousands of star systems were leaving the Republic, citing corruption, inefficiency, and the Senate's inability to address their legitimate grievances. What the Republic didn't know was that the entire separatist crisis was another of Palpatine's elaborate deceptions. Count Dooku, now calling himself Darth Tyrannus, was secretly Palpatine's new Sith apprentice, recruited after Palpatine had finally eliminated his old master, Plagueis. The separatist movement was real enough, the grievances were legitimate, and many of the leaders genuinely believed in their cause. But the entire conflict was being orchestrated from behind the scenes. The discovery of a secret clone army on Kamino seemed like a miracle. Just when the Republic needed military forces to combat the separatist threat, they found a ready-made army that had been in production for years. The Jedi were suspicious of this convenient timing, but the crisis was too urgent to investigate thoroughly. They accepted the clones as the Republic's salvation, not realizing they were embracing their own doom. Palpatine's response to the crisis was masterful. He expressed reluctance to accept the emergency powers the Senate offered him, insisting that he was a man of peace who had never sought such authority. But duty compelled him to act, and he would use these extraordinary powers only to preserve democracy and end the war as quickly as possible. The Senate cheered his noble sacrifice, not understanding that they had just voted to destroy the Republic they thought they were saving. The Clone Wars themselves were a work of art in strategic deception. Palpatine controlled both sides of the conflict, ensuring that it would continue just long enough to serve his purposes. The war had to be big enough to justify the emergency powers and the military buildup, but not so overwhelming that it would destroy the galaxy he intended to rule. It had to last long enough to exhaust the Jedi and turn public opinion against them, but not so long that people would lose faith in his leadership. Most importantly, the war allowed Palpatine to begin the process of transforming the Republic into an empire. Each new crisis justified additional emergency powers, additional military forces, and additional restrictions on civil liberties. The changes came gradually, each one seeming reasonable given the circumstances, but together they fundamentally altered the nature of galactic government.
Chapter 7: The Corruption of Anakin Skywalker. While the galaxy burned in war, Palpatine's most important project continued in secret. Anakin Skywalker had grown into one of the most powerful Jedi of his generation, but also one of the most conflicted. His marriage to Padme Amidala, conducted in secret, created a constant source of tension with the Jedi Code. His friendship with Palpatine provided an outlet for frustrations he couldn't share with his Jedi mentors. Palpatine's corruption of Anakin was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation. He never directly criticized the Jedi Order or encouraged Anakin to break their rules. Instead, he simply listened sympathetically when Anakin expressed his frustrations, offered gentle observations about the Order's limitations, and gradually helped Anakin rationalize his own growing anger and resentment. The key was understanding what Anakin truly wanted. Beneath all his Jedi training, Anakin was driven by fear. Fear of loss, fear of powerlessness, fear of being unable to protect the people he loved. Palpatine fed that fear carefully, subtly, always with plausible deniability. He spoke of the tragedy of Anakin's mother, of the terrible burden of having such power but being restricted from using it to help others. When Anakin began having visions of Padme dying in childbirth, Palpatine saw his opportunity. He had planted these visions through the Force, using his mastery of the dark side to project Anakin's deepest fears back at him as prophetic dreams. Now he could position himself as the only person willing to help Anakin save his wife, even if it meant bending the rules. The revelation of Palpatine's Sith identity was timed perfectly. Anakin was desperate, isolated from his Jedi mentors by his secret marriage and his growing doubts about their methods. When Palpatine revealed that he was Darth Sidious, he didn't present it as a betrayal, but as a gift of trust. He was sharing his greatest secret with Anakin because he saw the young Jedi's potential, because he believed Anakin could help him bring peace and order to the galaxy. The promise of power over death was the final hook.
Palpatine claimed that only through the dark side could Anakin gain the power to save Padme, to prevent the future he had seen in his visions. The Jedi would never teach him these abilities. They were too narrow-minded, too bound by their obsolete code. But together, master and apprentice could unlock the secrets that would make loss a thing of the past.
Chapter 8: Order 66 and the Great Purge. The execution of Order 66 represented the culmination of decades of planning. Every clone trooper in the Grand Army of the Republic had been programmed with behavioral modification biochips that would compel them to turn on their Jedi commanders when the order was given. The Jedi who had fought alongside these clones for 3 years trusted them completely. That trust made the betrayal all the more devastating. Across the galaxy, Jedi Masters, Knights, and Padawans were gunned down by the soldiers they had led into battle. Some fought back, their lightsabers deflecting blaster bolts in desperate last stands, but they were vastly outnumbered and completely unprepared for betrayal from their own forces. Within hours, thousands of years of Jedi tradition had been nearly eradicated. At the Jedi Temple on Coruscant, the massacre was led by Anakin Skywalker himself, now rechristened as Darth Vader. His assault on the temple was both a military necessity and a symbolic act of transformation. By leading the attack against his former brothers and sisters, Vader was burning the last bridges to his previous life, embracing his new identity as a Sith Lord. The slaughter of the younglings was perhaps the most horrific aspect of the entire purge. These children, some barely old enough to hold a lightsaber, posed no military threat to the new regime. But Palpatine understood that mercy was weakness, and that Vader's transformation required him to commit acts that made return impossible. By killing the children, Vader demonstrated his complete commitment to the dark side. Meanwhile, Palpatine was putting the finishing touches on his political transformation. He appeared before the Senate to announce that the Jedi had attempted to overthrow the Republic, that their rebellion had been crushed, and that these traitors would be remembered as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power. The cheers that greeted his announcement echoed through history as the sound of freedom dying.
Chapter 9: The Birth of Darth Vader. On the volcanic world of Mustafar, the final act of Anakin Skywalker's transformation played out in fire and fury. His lightsaber duel with Obi-Wan Kenobi was more than just a battle between former friends. It was a symbolic confrontation between the light and dark sides of the Force, between the Jedi ideals Anakin had once embraced and the Sith philosophy he now served. The fight itself was brutal and personal. These two men had been like brothers, had fought side by side through countless battles during the Clone Wars. Now they faced each other across a river of lava, their lightsabers casting strange shadows in the hellish landscape. Obi-Wan fought with the desperate hope that he could still reach the good man he knew Anakin had once been. Anakin fought with the fury of someone who had burned away everything he used to be. When Obi-Wan gained the high ground, he pleaded with his former Padawan one last time. But Anakin was beyond redemption now, consumed by rage and overconfidence. His attempt to leap over Obi-Wan ended in disaster, his legs and remaining arms severed by his former master. As he burned on the slopes of Mustafar, Anakin Skywalker died, leaving only the shell that would become Darth Vader. Palpatine's arrival on Mustafar served multiple purposes. Obviously, he needed to save his new apprentice from death, but the Emperor also wanted to ensure that Vader's transformation was complete. The life support suit, the iconic mask, the mechanical breathing, all of this was necessary to keep Vader alive, but it also served to separate him further from his former identity. The man in the black armor was a living reminder of the price of defying the Emperor. The suit itself was a blessing and a curse. It gave Vader the power to survive injuries that would have killed any normal being, made him more machine than man, an avatar of Imperial might. But it also made him dependent on Palpatine's technology, ensured that he could never fully challenge his master's authority. Every breath Vader took was a reminder of his servitude. The psychological impact of the transformation was just as important as the physical changes. Vader's first act in his new form was to learn of Padmé's death, the very fate he had turned to the dark side to prevent. The knowledge that his actions had killed the woman he loved completed his fall, ensuring that any remaining spark of goodness was buried beneath layers of guilt, rage, and self-hatred.
Chapter 10: The Emperor's New Empire. With the Jedi extinct and his primary enforcer transformed into the perfect weapon, Palpatine began the process of reshaping galactic civilization in his image. The empire he created was a twisted reflection of everything the Republic had claimed to represent, maintaining the appearance of order and justice while serving only the Emperor's will. The imperial bureaucracy became a machine for oppression, its countless departments and agencies working together to monitor, control, and exploit the galaxy's citizens. Every aspect of life became subject to imperial regulation, from trade and travel to education and entertainment. The Empire's reach extended into every corner of civilized space, its agents watching for any sign of dissent or rebellion. The military became the Empire's most visible symbol of power. The white-armored stormtroopers, the massive star destroyers, the regional governors with their vast fleets, all of this was designed to project imperial might across the galaxy. But the military served a psychological purpose as well as a practical one. Its very existence reminded citizens that the Empire had the power to destroy any who opposed it. Palpatine himself became increasingly isolated from the day-to-day governance of his empire. He surrounded himself with advisors and administrators, but these beings were tools rather than counselors. The Emperor made all important decisions personally, trusting no one with significant independent authority. This centralization of power made the Empire incredibly efficient in some ways, but also created dangerous vulnerabilities. The construction of the Death Star represented the ultimate expression of Palpatine's philosophy of rule through fear. A weapon capable of destroying entire planets served no practical military purpose. No rebellion could threaten imperial rule enough to justify such extreme measures. But the Death Star was never really about military necessity. It was about psychological domination, about creating a weapon so terrifying that the mere threat of its use would keep entire star systems in line. Vader's role in this new order was complex. On one hand, he served as the Emperor's primary enforcer, the Dark Knight who carried out the most difficult and sensitive missions. His reputation for ruthlessness and his mastery of the Force made him an invaluable tool for maintaining imperial discipline. On the other hand, his very existence was a reminder of Palpatine's greatest triumph, the corruption and destruction of the Chosen One himself.
Chapter 8, Order 66, represented the culmination of decades of planning. Every clone trooper in the Grand Army of the Republic had been programmed with behavioral modification biochips that would compel them to turn on their Jedi commanders when the order was given. The Jedi, who had fought alongside these clones for 3 years, trusted them completely. That trust made the betrayal all the more devastating. Across the galaxy, Jedi Masters, Knights, and Padawans were gunned down by the soldiers they had led into battle. Some fought back, their lightsabers deflecting blaster bolts in desperate last stands, but they were vastly outnumbered and completely unprepared for betrayal from their own forces. Within hours, thousands of years of Jedi tradition had been nearly eradicated. At the Jedi Temple on Coruscant, the massacre was led by Anakin Skywalker himself, now rechristened as Darth Vader. His assault on the temple was both a military necessity and a symbolic act of transformation. By leading the attack against his former brothers and sisters, Vader was burning the last bridges to his previous life, embracing his new identity as a Sith Lord. The slaughter of the younglings was perhaps the most horrific aspect of the entire purge. These children, some barely old enough to hold a lightsaber, posed no military threat to the new regime. But Palpatine understood that mercy was weakness, and that Vader's transformation required him to commit acts that made return impossible. By killing the children, Vader demonstrated his complete commitment to the dark side. Meanwhile, Palpatine was putting the finishing touches on his political transformation. He appeared before the Senate to announce that the Jedi had attempted to overthrow the Republic, that their rebellion had been crushed, and that these traitors would be remembered as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power. The senators, many of whom had worked with Jedi for years, were shocked by these revelations, but had no choice but to accept their Chancellor's word. The transformation of the Republic into the Empire was presented as a reluctant but necessary response to the crisis. Palpatine claimed that the Republic's democratic institutions had proven unable to prevent the Jedi conspiracy, that stronger leadership was needed to ensure such betrayal could never happen again. The cheers that greeted his announcement echoed through history as the sound of freedom dying.
Chapter 9. The Birth of Darth Vader. On the volcanic world of Mustafar, the final act of Anakin Skywalker's transformation played out in fire and fury. His lightsaber duel with Obi-Wan Kenobi was more than just a battle between former friends. It was a symbolic confrontation between the light and dark sides of the Force, between the Jedi ideals Anakin had once embraced and the Sith philosophy he now served. The fight itself was brutal and personal. These two men had been like brothers, had fought side by side through countless battles during the Clone Wars. Now they faced each other across a river of lava, their lightsabers casting strange shadows in the hellish landscape. Obi-Wan fought with the desperate hope that he could still reach the good man he knew Anakin had once been. Anakin fought with the fury of someone who had burned away everything he used to be. When Obi-Wan gained the high ground, he pleaded with his former Padawan one last time. But Anakin was beyond redemption now, consumed by rage and overconfidence. His attempt to leap over Obi-Wan ended in disaster, his legs and remaining arms severed by his former master's lightsaber. As he burned on the slopes of Mustafar, Anakin Skywalker died, leaving only the shell that would become Darth Vader. Palpatine's arrival on Mustafar served multiple purposes. Obviously, he needed to save his new apprentice from death, but the Emperor also wanted to ensure that Vader's transformation was complete. The life support suit, the iconic mask, the mechanical breathing, all of this was necessary to keep Vader alive, but it also served to separate him further from his former identity. The man in the black armor was a living reminder of the price of defying the Emperor. The suit itself was a blessing and a curse. It gave Vader the power to survive injuries that would have killed any normal being, made him more machine than man, an avatar of Imperial might. But it also made him dependent on Palpatine's technology, ensured that he could never fully challenge his master's authority. Every breath Vader took was a reminder of his servitude. The psychological impact of the transformation was just as important as the physical changes. Vader's first act in his new form was to learn of Padme's death, the very fate he had turned to the dark side to prevent. The knowledge that his actions had killed the woman he loved completed his fall, ensuring that any remaining spark of goodness was buried beneath layers of guilt, rage, and self-hatred.
Chapter 10: The Emperor's New Empire. With the Jedi extinct and his primary enforcer transformed into the perfect weapon, Palpatine began the process of reshaping galactic civilization in his image. The empire he created was a twisted reflection of everything the Republic had claimed to represent, maintaining the appearance of order and justice while serving only the Emperor's will. The imperial bureaucracy became a machine for oppression, its countless departments and agencies working together to monitor, control, and exploit the galaxy's citizens. Every aspect of life became subject to imperial regulation, from trade and travel to education and entertainment. The Empire's reach extended into every corner of civilized space, its agents watching for any sign of dissent or rebellion. The military became the Empire's most visible symbol of power. The white-armored stormtroopers, the massive star destroyers, the regional governors with their vast fleets, all of this was designed to project imperial might across the galaxy. But the military served a psychological purpose as well as a practical one. Its very existence reminded citizens that the Empire had the power to destroy any who opposed it. Palpatine himself became increasingly isolated from the day-to-day governance of his empire. He surrounded himself with advisors and administrators, but these beings were tools rather than counselors. The Emperor made all important decisions personally, trusting no one with significant independent authority. This centralization of power made the Empire incredibly efficient in some ways, but also created dangerous vulnerabilities. The construction of the Death Star represented the ultimate expression of Palpatine's philosophy of rule through fear. A weapon capable of destroying entire planets served no practical military purpose. No rebellion could threaten imperial rule enough to justify such extreme measures. But the Death Star was never really about military necessity. It was about psychological domination, about creating a weapon so terrifying that the mere threat of its use would keep entire star systems in line. Vader's role in this new order was complex. On one hand, he served as the Emperor's primary enforcer, the Dark Knight who carried out the most difficult and sensitive missions. His reputation for ruthlessness and his mastery of the Force made him an invaluable tool for maintaining imperial discipline. On the other hand, his very existence was a reminder of Palpatine's greatest triumph, the corruption and destruction of the Chosen One himself.
Chapter 11: The Hunt for the Jedi. In the years following Order 66, scattered Jedi survivors emerged from hiding, driven by conscience or desperation to oppose the Empire's tyranny. These survivors represented more than just a military threat. They were living symbols of hope, proof that the Emperor's victory was not complete. Palpatine understood that every Jedi who remained alive was a potential rallying point for rebellion, a reminder of what the galaxy had lost. The hunt for these survivors became one of Vader's primary responsibilities. His knowledge of Jedi techniques and hiding places, combined with his mastery of the dark side, made him uniquely qualified to track down his former colleagues. Each hunt was deeply personal for Vader, a confrontation with his past and a reinforcement of his new identity. The Inquisitors, former Jedi who had been captured and turned to the dark side, served as Vader's agents in this campaign. These fallen Jedi were perfect tools for hunting their former brethren, possessing the skills to combat Force users, but lacking the strength to challenge Vader himself. Their very existence proved that the Jedi way was weak, that power was the only truth that mattered. Some Jedi chose to fight, making desperate last stands against Imperial forces. Others went into deep hiding, abandoning their connection to the Force to avoid detection. A few, like Obi-Wan Kenobi, took on new identities and watched over the children of their fallen comrades, waiting for a chance to restore the Jedi Order. Each response reflected different aspects of the Jedi philosophy, but none could escape the shadow of the Empire forever. For Palpatine, the hunt served multiple purposes. Obviously, it removed potential threats to his rule and eliminated sources of inspiration for rebellious movements. But it also continued Vader's training in the dark side, each kill reinforcing his commitment to the Sith way. Most importantly, it demonstrated to the galaxy that the Emperor's reach was infinite, that no one could escape Imperial justice forever.
Chapter 12: The Growing Rebellion. Despite the Empire's best efforts to maintain absolute control, resistance movements began to form across the galaxy. These early rebel cells were small, poorly equipped, and largely disconnected from each other. But they represented something the Emperor had not fully anticipated: the galaxy's refusal to accept tyranny as permanent. The rebels came from all walks of life and all corners of the galaxy. Former Republic senators who had been marginalized or eliminated by the Imperial government. Military officers who had become disgusted with the Empire's excesses. Ordinary citizens who had lost family members to Imperial justice or who simply refused to live in fear. Each had their own reasons for opposing the Empire, but together they represented a growing threat to Palpatine's order. The formation of the Rebel Alliance marked a turning point in galactic history. For the first time since the Empire's creation, opposition groups began to coordinate their efforts, sharing intelligence and resources in a unified campaign against Imperial rule. The Alliance's leaders understood that isolated cells could accomplish little against the Empire's vast resources, but a coordinated rebellion might have a chance. The Death Star's construction gave the rebellion its first major strategic objective. Intelligence gathered by Bothan spies revealed the weapon's existence and its terrible purpose, providing the Alliance with crucial information about the Empire's ultimate weapon. The plan stolen by Rogue One showed that the Death Star had a fatal flaw, a weakness that could be exploited by a small, fast ship carrying proton torpedoes. Palpatine viewed the rebellion with a mixture of contempt and concern. On one hand, he understood that opposition was inevitable. No government, no matter how powerful, could completely eliminate dissent. The rebels were gnats buzzing around a giant, capable of minor annoyances but ultimately powerless against the Empire's might. On the other hand, he recognized that popular movements could grow dangerous if left unchecked, and that the rebellion's existence undermined the image of invincibility he had worked so hard to create. The Emperor's response to the rebellion was characteristically ruthless. Entire planets suspected of harboring rebel sympathies faced Imperial occupation or bombardment. The destruction of Alderaan was meant to serve as an object lesson. This was what happened to worlds that supported the rebellion. But the attack had the opposite effect, proving to many that the Empire was capable of any atrocity, and that resistance was the only moral choice.
Chapter 13: The Death Star's Destruction. The Battle of Yavin represented the rebellion's first major victory against the Empire, but it was also something more. It was proof that the Emperor was not invincible, that his most terrifying weapon could be destroyed by courage and determination. For Palpatine, the Death Star's destruction was both a military setback and a propaganda disaster of enormous proportions. The actual battle revealed several concerning trends that the Emperor could not ignore. First, the rebels had managed to obtain complete technical readouts of the Death Star, suggesting that Imperial security was not as impenetrable as he had believed. Second, they had identified and exploited a design flaw that his engineers had assured him was insignificant. Most troubling of all, the attack had succeeded largely due to the actions of a young pilot who displayed obvious Force sensitivity. Luke Skywalker's role in the Death Star's destruction raised questions that Palpatine was not yet ready to confront. The boy's ability to make an impossible shot, guided by the Force, suggested that he had received some training from a surviving Jedi. More concerning still was the possibility that this might be the son of Anakin Skywalker, a development that could complicate Palpatine's long-term plans. The political ramifications of the Death Star's destruction were just as serious as the military ones. Across the galaxy, beings who had accepted Imperial rule as inevitable began to wonder if the Empire might actually be vulnerable. Recruitment to rebel cells increased dramatically, and previously neutral systems began providing covert support to the Alliance. The rebellion was no longer a minor nuisance, it was becoming a genuine threat. Palpatine's response was swift and brutal. The survivors of the Death Star project were executed as traitors, and new security protocols were implemented throughout the Imperial military. Construction began immediately on a second Death Star, one that would be even more powerful than its predecessor, and free from the design flaws that had doomed the first station. But the Emperor also began to plan for a more personal response to the rebellion's success. If a Force-sensitive pilot had been responsible for his weapon's destruction, then perhaps it was time to take a more direct role in crushing the Alliance. The rebels had won their first major victory, but they would soon learn that they had also attracted the personal attention of the most dangerous being in the galaxy.
Chapter 14. The Emperor's Trap. The construction of the second Death Star above the forest moon of Endor was more than just a replacement for the weapon destroyed at Yavin. It was the centerpiece of an elaborate trap designed to eliminate the Rebel Alliance once and for all. Palpatine had learned from his previous defeat, and this time he would personally oversee the destruction of his enemies. The plan was brilliant in its simplicity. Allow the rebels to discover the location of the new Death Star, let them believe that the weapon was still under construction and vulnerable to attack, then spring the trap when their entire fleet arrived for what they thought would be a decisive strike. The Emperor would be aboard the Death Star personally, protected by an entire Imperial fleet, ready to watch as the rebellion died around the fires of Endor. But Palpatine had an even more important objective than simply destroying the rebel fleet. Luke Skywalker, the young Jedi who had destroyed the first Death Star, would surely be part of the attack. The Emperor intended to capture Luke and complete what he had begun with Anakin decades earlier, the corruption of another Skywalker to the dark side. The revelation that Luke was indeed Vader's son had provided Palpatine with new opportunities and new concerns. On one hand, the boy's bloodline meant he had tremendous potential in the Force, possibly even greater than his father's. On the other hand, the family connection created emotional vulnerabilities that could be exploited by either side. The Emperor decided to use the relationship to his advantage, arranging for father and son to confront each other in the ultimate test of loyalty. Luke's arrival on Endor, his surrender to Imperial forces, and his transport to the Death Star all proceeded exactly as Palpatine had foreseen. The young Jedi was walking into the most carefully prepared trap in galactic history, facing not just the most powerful Sith Lord who had ever lived, but also his own father, now transformed into the Emperor's most deadly servant. The psychological dimensions of the trap were just as important as the military ones. Palpatine intended to force Luke to watch as his friends died, to feel their pain through the Force, and to realize that his commitment to the Jedi way was responsible for their deaths. Only by embracing the dark side could Luke gain the power to save them, but doing so would complete his fall and provide the Emperor with a new apprentice even more powerful than Vader.
Chapter 15: The Throne Room Confrontation. The confrontation in the Death Star's throne room represented the culmination of everything Palpatine had worked toward for over 40 years. Here, in the heart of his ultimate weapon, with his current apprentice at his side and his potential replacement in chains before him, the Emperor prepared to complete his greatest triumph, the corruption of Luke Skywalker and the final destruction of the Jedi way. Palpatine's psychological assault on Luke was masterful, drawing on decades of experience in manipulation and corruption. He began by demonstrating his complete knowledge of the rebel plan, his casual dismissal of their efforts, and his absolute confidence in their destruction. The shield generator on Endor would not be destroyed, he revealed, because his best troops were waiting in ambush. The rebel fleet would find a Death Star fully operational and protected by the entire Imperial Navy. As the space battle raged outside the throne room's massive windows, Palpatine encouraged Luke to give in to his anger, to strike down his defenseless enemy, and embrace the power of the dark side. Each rebel ship destroyed, each friend who died in the battle was presented as proof of the futility of Luke's commitment to the light. Only through hatred and anger could he gain the strength to save his friends and defeat his enemies. The lightsaber duel between Luke and Vader served multiple purposes in Palpatine's plan. It was a test of Luke's abilities, a demonstration of Vader's continued loyalty, and most importantly, a psychological pressure designed to push the young Jedi toward the dark side. As father and son fought with deadly intent, Palpatine fed on their emotions, drawing power from their conflict while waiting for the moment when Luke's defenses would finally crumble. When Luke finally gave in to his anger and defeated Vader, Palpatine thought he had achieved his ultimate victory. The young Jedi had proven his power by striking down his own father, had demonstrated his willingness to kill in anger, and had shown that he could be pushed beyond the limits of Jedi discipline. All that remained was for Luke to complete his fall by killing his helpless enemy and claiming his place at the Emperor's side. But Luke's refusal to deliver the killing blow, his declaration that he was a Jedi like his father before him, represented something Palpatine had not anticipated: the possibility that someone could touch the dark side and still choose the light. For the first time in decades, the Emperor had encountered something beyond his understanding and control.
Chapter 16: The Emperor's End. Luke's defiance in the throne room marked the beginning of the end for Palpatine's reign. Faced with a Jedi who could not be corrupted, who had proven himself capable of resisting the dark side even in his moment of greatest anger, the Emperor fell back on the crude application of power that he had always claimed to despise. If Luke would not be his apprentice, then he would die. The Force lightning that poured from Palpatine's fingertips was more than just a weapon. It was the physical manifestation of his hatred, his rage at being denied the victory he had spent so long preparing for. For decades, he had achieved his goals through manipulation and deception. But now he revealed the raw power that had always lurked beneath his political facade. As Luke writhed in agony, something unexpected happened. Vader, the perfect servant who had never questioned his master's will, began to stir. The sight of his son being tortured awakened something that Palpatine thought he had destroyed forever. the remnants of Anakin Skywalker's compassion. The Emperor had succeeded too well in his corruption. He had made Vader care about nothing, and now that very emptiness left room for something new to grow. Vader's decision to save his son was the one thing Palpatine had never planned for. In all his scheming, in all his manipulation, he had never considered that his greatest triumph, the corruption of Anakin Skywalker, might also contain the seeds of his own destruction. The man he had broken and rebuilt as the perfect weapon had retained just enough humanity to choose love over fear, sacrifice over survival. The physical act of lifting the Emperor and hurling him into the Death Star's reactor shaft was almost anticlimactic compared to its psychological significance. Vader's betrayal represented the failure of everything Palpatine had believed about the nature of power and control. He had thought that fear and hatred were stronger than love and compassion, that the dark side was inevitable for anyone who truly understood the nature of the universe. He was wrong. As Palpatine fell into the reactor core, his body consumed by very energy that powered his ultimate weapon, the galaxy felt a disturbance in the Force unlike anything in living memory. The death of the most powerful Sith Lord who had ever lived sent shockwaves through the cosmic force, a moment of balance restored after decades of darkness.
Chapter 17: The Empire's Collapse. The Emperor's death aboard the second Death Star triggered a collapse that Palpatine had never anticipated. His empire, built around the principle of absolute centralized control, had no mechanism for succession, no way to function without his direct oversight. The moment his presence vanished from the galaxy, the carefully constructed edifice of imperial power began to crumble. On Coruscant, news of the Emperor's death sparked immediate chaos. Imperial officials, unsure of who held authority in the new order, began making desperate attempts to secure their own positions. Some declared themselves regional governors, attempting to carve out independent fiefdoms from the Empire's remains. Others fled the capital entirely, taking whatever resources they could carry and disappearing into the galaxy's outer reaches. The military faced an even more serious crisis of command. Without clear leadership from Coruscant, fleet commanders had to decide whether to continue fighting a war that might already be over, retreat to defensive positions, or surrender to rebel forces. Many chose to fight on, either from loyalty to imperial ideals or simple inability to imagine any alternative to the order they had served their entire careers. But the Empire's collapse was more than just about political and military confusion. Palpatine's death had removed the dark side influence that had held the galaxy in thrall for over 2 decades. Planets that had submitted to imperial rule out of fear now found the courage to rebel. Systems that had provided resources to the Empire began cutting off supplies. The vast network of informants and collaborators that had maintained imperial control started to dissolve, as people realized that the Emperor's reach was no longer infinite. The revelation of Palpatine's true nature, his identity as a Sith Lord, provided the final blow to imperial legitimacy. Citizens who had supported the Empire as a force for order and stability learned that they had been serving a practitioner of the dark arts, a man who had orchestrated the very conflicts he claimed to be solving. The political movement that had presented itself as the guardian of civilization was revealed to have been led by its greatest enemy. Even in death, however, Palpatine's influence lingered. The empire he had created was too vast and too entrenched to simply disappear overnight. Imperial commanders who refused to accept defeat continued fighting, creating the conditions for years of civil war. The cultural and psychological changes wrought by decades of authoritarian rule could not be easily undone. Most significantly, the Emperor had prepared contingency plans for the possibility of his death, secret protocols that would ensure his legacy survived even if he did not.
Chapter 18: The Dark Empire. Unknown to the Rebel Alliance and the fragments of the Empire itself, Palpatine had spent decades preparing for the possibility of his own death. His studies of the dark side had revealed techniques that transcended physical existence, ways to preserve consciousness beyond the destruction of the body. The Emperor's apparent death at Endor was merely a transition to a new phase of his existence. On the hidden Sith world of Biss in the deep core, Palpatine had constructed a secret fortress where his most loyal servants maintained a collection of clone bodies. Through dark-side techniques learned from his master Plagueis and perfected through years of experimentation, the Emperor's spirit survived his physical death, eventually inhabiting one of these prepared vessels. But resurrection came at a cost. Each time Palpatine transferred his consciousness to a new clone body, the process took a toll on his spirit, accelerating its decay and corruption. The clone bodies themselves were imperfect, aging rapidly under the strain of containing such powerful dark side energy. The Emperor who returned was more powerful in some ways than ever before, but also more unstable, more obviously consumed by the darkness he served. The revelation of Palpatine's survival sent shockwaves through both the New Republic and the Imperial Remnant. For the rebels who had celebrated victory at Endor, the news that their greatest enemy still lived was devastating. For Imperial loyalists, the Emperor's return offered hope of restoration and revenge. The galaxy found itself plunged into a new conflict, one that would determine whether the Empire's defeat had been real or merely temporary. Palpatine's strategy in this new phase focused on exploiting the New Republic's weaknesses while rebuilding Imperial strength. His secret fleet, hidden in the deep core and equipped with new superweapons, represented a threat that the Rebel Alliance had never faced. The Emperor himself was no longer bound by the need to maintain political appearances. He could reveal his true nature as a Sith Lord and rule through open application of dark-side power. The conflict that followed was more personal than the original Galactic Civil War. This was not about political systems or military strategies, but about the fundamental question of whether good or evil would ultimately triumph in the galaxy. Palpatine had returned not just to reclaim his empire, but to complete his transformation of galactic civilization into something that served only the dark side.
Chapter 19: The Final Darkness. In his resurrected form, Palpatine abandoned all pretense of benevolence or political legitimacy. The Emperor, who had once presented himself as the Republic's savior, now openly embraced his role as the galaxy's destroyer. His new empire would not maintain the illusion of serving the people. It would exist solely to feed his hunger for power and to spread the influence of the dark side to every corner of known space. The superweapons developed in the deep core represented the ultimate expression of Palpatine's philosophy. The Eclipse-class star dreadnoughts, equipped with super laser cannons capable of destroying planetary surfaces, were designed to rule through terror on a scale that made the original Death Star seem restrained. The Emperor no longer needed to justify his actions or maintain popular support. He would simply destroy any world that opposed him. Palpatine's personal transformation was even more dramatic than his political one. Free from the need to hide his true nature, he allowed the dark side to reshape his clone bodies into forms that reflected his inner corruption. His appearance became increasingly inhuman, his features twisted by decades of channeling dark-side energy. He was becoming something beyond mortal comprehension, a being of pure evil that existed only to spread suffering and despair. The assault on the New Republic was swift and brutal. Planets that had celebrated their freedom from imperial rule found themselves facing destruction from weapons beyond their ability to resist. The Emperor's new fleet swept through Republic space, its commanders carrying out orders to eliminate not just military targets, but entire populations that had supported the rebellion. But even as Palpatine achieved military victories that surpassed his previous conquests, the fundamental instability of his resurrected existence began to manifest. The clone bodies were failing faster than ever, requiring him to transfer his consciousness more frequently and causing increasing damage to his spirit each time. The dark side power that sustained him was also consuming him, creating a cycle of decay that even his mastery of Sith techniques could not permanently arrest. The Emperor's growing desperation led him to seek more radical solutions to his mortality problem. Ancient Sith techniques, dangerous experiments with the Force, forbidden rituals that required the sacrifice of entire worlds, all became tools in his quest to achieve true immortality. But each attempt only accelerated his spiritual decay, pushing him further from anything recognizably human.
Chapter 20: Legacy of Darkness. The ultimate defeat of Palpatine's Dark Empire came not through military victory alone, but through the realization that his greatest strength had become his greatest weakness. His complete embrace of the dark side, his transformation into a being of pure evil, had left him vulnerable to the very forces he had spent his life trying to control. Luke Skywalker's final confrontation with the Emperor was as much philosophical as it was physical. The young Jedi Master had learned that Palpatine could not be defeated through violence alone. His spirit was too powerful, his connection to the dark side too complete. Instead, Luke sought to break the cycle of hatred and revenge that had sustained the Sith for generations. The technique that finally destroyed Palpatine was one the Emperor had never understood: the willing sacrifice of power for the sake of others. Luke's decision to absorb and redirect the Emperor's Force lightning, knowing it would likely kill him, represented everything that Palpatine had never been able to comprehend about the nature of true strength. As Palpatine's spirit was finally consumed by the very darkness he had served, the galaxy felt his passing as a moment of liberation unlike any in recorded history. The shadow that had hung over galactic civilization for over 40 years was finally lifted, allowing the light of hope and freedom to shine once more. But even in final defeat, Palpatine's legacy lived on. The empire he had created, the techniques he had perfected, the corruption he had spread, all of these would influence galactic history for generations to come. Future dark-side users would study his methods, learn from his successes, and attempt to duplicate his achievements. The Emperor was gone, but the idea of the Emperor would prove harder to kill. The institutional changes wrought by Palpatine's reign could not be easily undone. Entire generations had grown up under imperial rule, knowing no other form of government. The military traditions, the bureaucratic structures, the cultural attitudes shaped by decades of authoritarianism, all of these would persist long after the Emperor's death. Building a new form of galactic government would require not just military victory, but a fundamental transformation of how billions of beings understood power, authority, and citizenship.
Chapter 21: The Sith Eternal. Yet even final death could not contain the full scope of Palpatine's malevolence. On the hidden Sith world of Exegol, deep in the unknown regions, the Emperor had prepared his ultimate contingency. Here, in ancient temples built by the Sith of old, he had established a cult dedicated to preserving his legacy and preparing for his eventual return. The Sith Eternal, as his followers called themselves, had spent decades gathering resources, building fleets, and conducting experiments in dark side manipulation. Their loyalty to Palpatine transcended mere politics or ideology. They saw him as the ultimate expression of Sith power, a being worthy of worship and absolute obedience. Even his death would not shake their faith, for they believed that death was merely another barrier for their master to overcome. The Emperor's spirit, though apparently destroyed, had left behind traces of itself scattered across the galaxy. These fragments, embedded in Sith artifacts, Force-sensitive locations, and the minds of his most devoted followers, contained the potential for his return. Given enough time, enough dark side energy, and enough willing servants, these fragments could be gathered and reconstituted into something resembling the Emperor's original consciousness. The process of resurrection was far more complex and dangerous than Palpatine's previous returns from death. It required not just clone bodies and dark side rituals, but the willing sacrifice of countless lives to provide the energy necessary to bridge the gap between life and death. The Sith Eternal had spent decades preparing for this moment, gathering the resources and followers necessary to bring their Dark Master back to life. But this final resurrection would come at a terrible price. The Emperor who returned would be more powerful than ever before, sustained by the collective will of his followers and armed with weapons that made his previous superweapons seem primitive. The Final Order, as his new military force was called, represented the culmination of everything he had learned about ruling through fear and the application of overwhelming force.
Chapter 22: The Rise of Skywalker. The Emperor's return coincided with the emergence of a new generation of Force users, including Rey, a young woman whose connection to the Force rivaled that of the Skywalker line itself. What she didn't initially understand was that this power came with a terrible legacy. She was Palpatine's granddaughter, the descendant of the very evil she sought to destroy. The revelation of Rey's parentage was Palpatine's final manipulation, a trap that had been set in motion decades earlier. Her father had been the Emperor's son, a failed clone who had chosen love over power and had fled Palpatine's service. By allowing his son to escape and raise a family, the Emperor had unknowingly set in motion the events that would lead to his ultimate confrontation with his own bloodline. Rey's struggle with her dark heritage paralleled Palpatine's own journey from senator to emperor, but in reverse. Where he had gradually embraced the darkness within himself, she fought constantly against the pull of her ancestry. Every use of her power carried the risk of following in her grandfather's footsteps, of becoming the very thing she had sworn to destroy. The Emperor saw Rey not as a threat, but as an opportunity. Here was a being with his own bloodline, possessing power that could sustain his spirit indefinitely. If he could convince her to strike him down in anger, her hatred would complete the ritual that would transfer his essence into her body. He would live again, not in a rapidly decaying clone, but in the body of someone young, powerful, and connected to the Force in ways that even he had never achieved. The psychological warfare that Palpatine waged on Rey was perhaps his most sophisticated manipulation yet. He presented himself not as her enemy, but as her destiny, the inevitable result of embracing the power that flowed in her veins.
Every victory she achieved through anger, every moment when she called upon the dark side to save her friends was presented as evidence that she was becoming him. The final confrontation on Exegol brought together all the themes of Palpatine's long life: the corruption of the innocent, the price of power, and the ultimate question of whether evil could truly be permanent in a universe where good still existed. As Rey faced her grandfather in the heart of his greatest stronghold, surrounded by the artifacts and followers of 1,000 years of Sith tradition, the fate of the galaxy hung in the balance one final time.